As Secretary of State under President George Bush Sr., James Baker helped shape American foreign policy during a revolutionary period in world history. The events that took place on his watch were truly extraordinary. He oversaw the end of the Cold War, the liberation of Central and Eastern Europe, the unification of West and East Germany, and the management of relations with a dissolving Soviet Union. He was instrumental in building the coalition that reversed Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, and he advanced the process of peace at the Madrid Middle East Peace Conference. As he has written in his 1995 memoir, The Politics of Diplomacy, Secretary Baker is an internationalist committed to the exercise of American post-Cold War leadership within a framework of global alliances and institutions. And in that respect, I believe he is linked to the internationalist foreign policy tradition of President Kennedy. James Baker first entered into national public service in 1975 as Undersecretary of Commerce for President Gerald Ford. He served as President Ronald Reagan's Secretary of the Treasury and Chairman of the President's Economic Policy Council before taking on the role of White House Chief of Staff. Over the course of 5 presidential elections, he led the presidential campaigns of Presidents Ford, Reagan, and Bush. And over the years, Secretary Baker has received many honors, including our nation's highest civilian award, the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1991. To moderate our forum this morning, we're fortunate to have with us the national political columnist for the Boston Globe, Tom Oliphant. Tom is a great friend of the Kennedy Library, in fact, so great that he is appearing here on our stage for the second time in 2 days. Despite his youthful demeanor, Tom has covered he says, has covered every presidential campaign since Richard Nixon's election in 1968. He is a perceptive commentator on national political and economic trends, and he was part of the team of Globe writers that was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for their reporting on Boston's school desegregation crisis in the 1970s. So please join me in welcoming Secretary James Baker and Tom Oliphant to the stage of the Kennedy Library.
Thank you very much, John, for that very generous introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure for me to be with you this morning, and as I begin, I would like to take note of John Shattuck's distinguished public service as well. It's a wonderful honor to be here at the Kennedy Library and to be here on a glorious day in Boston. I want to begin by sharing a confidence with you and telling you that I never intended at all to go into politics or public service. I was too busy trying to make it in the competitive atmosphere of a major Houston, Texas law firm to have any time for politics. And anyway, I had a grandfather who'd built that firm up who used to tell young lawyers that would join the firm, he said, if you want to be a good lawyer, work hard, study, and stay out of politics. And I followed grandfather's advice for a long time, and then through a series of coincidences, I became involved in politics. Some of these were tragic, some were happy coincidences. I lost a wife to cancer when she was 38 years old, and I had a tennis doubles partner at the time in Houston named George Bush, and he came to me and he said, Jim, he said, you know, you need to do something to take your mind off your grief. Why don't you help me run for the Senate here in Texas? And I said, well, George, I'd like to do that, but there are 2 problems with it. First of all, I don't know anything about politics. And secondly, I'm a Democrat. And he said, well, we can take care of that second problem. And we took care of it, and we ran a good race. We lost, but we won Houston, which is what I was responsible for, in a very narrow, in a pretty tight race statewide, but we won the city of Houston and the environs of Houston. One thing led to another, and I found myself after that up in Washington, as John said, serving President Ford as the Deputy Secretary of Commerce. I'd only been there about 6 months when another tragic circumstance happened. The delegate hunter for President Ford in his nomination contest against Governor Ronald Reagan, and by the way, that was the last seriously contested major party convention in this country, in which President Ford, a sitting president, won nomination by only 30 delegate votes out of some 3,000 delegate votes that were cast against his challenger, Governor Reagan from California. They wanted me to become the new delegate hunter. So I left the Commerce Department after only 6 months, went over and chased delegates for President Ford. We barely won the nomination, as I indicated. It was extraordinarily exciting. Tom Oliphant covered it. He probably remembers a lot about it. That was a very emotional and exciting thing. And then after the convention, President Ford asked me if I would become his national chairman against Governor Jimmy Carter. And I accepted, even though we were 30 points down in the polls at the time. We finished dead even. On the day the vote was taken, the two candidates polled exactly even. We lost that campaign for president by 17,000 votes out of some 81 million votes that were cast. And I remember that early the next morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, when it became apparent that we'd lost, and I remember thinking to myself, how bizarre this is. Here you were 5 years ago, a Democratic lawyer in Houston, Texas, and now you have run a campaign for an incumbent president of the United States in what is obviously the closest presidential election that we will ever experience in your lifetime. Well, as you know, that turned out not to be exactly the case, given what happened in the year 2000. Anyway, I was bitten by the political bug. I went home to Texas, and I thought, well, I was a pretty good lawyer. I'm going to try this politics business myself. And I filed to run for statewide office as Attorney General of Texas. And in those days, Texas was a solidly Democratic state. We had not elected a Republican statewide in Texas. This was 1978, since Reconstruction, except for one, Senator John Tower, who was running against 4 Democrats. He was one Republican running against 4 Democrats. And he won. But anyway, I was out there because I was really bitten by the bug. I never will forget one hot summer day somewhere up in the panhandle of Texas near Professor Mickey Edwards' home state of Oklahoma, probably somewhere around Lubbock. And I remember seeing some people in a shopping center, and I was going over to give them some campaign literature. Bear in mind now, I'd gotten a lot of face time on television as Ford's national chairman. Stick out my hand to introduce myself to this guy, and before I can say a word, he looks at me and he says, "Say," he said, "anybody ever tell you you look like Jim Baker?" and I said, "Yes, often." This guy never batted an eyelash. He said, "Doesn't it make you mad?" That was the first hint I had that I wasn't going to win that race. We had a nice breakfast upstairs with a few folks here earlier, and I'm just gonna make a few comments in the hopes that will generate in your mind some ideas for questions on a variety of subjects. Tom's already probably got a bunch of tough questions ready to go, but let me talk briefly with you a little bit about Iraq and about North Korea and about the Arab-Israeli peace process, because these things are right at the very top of the news these days. I don't think whether you were for this war or whether you were against this war, I think very few people will argue today with the success of the military operation, both from the standpoint of the time it took, from the standpoint of the limited number of casualties, and of course one casualty, one death is too many, but this was really truly an extraordinary military operation, and in some respects far different from the war we fought in the Gulf in 1991 when I was Secretary of State. When you look at the damage to the infrastructure of the country, it was far less than we imposed upon that country in 1991, far less indeed than we imposed upon our opponent when we did the right thing by fighting for the rights of the people of Kosovo. The strides that have been made in military technology just in the 10 or 11 years since the Gulf War are extraordinary. That Gulf War was the first time, you'll remember, when people had a chance to see laser-guided munitions work. And now the technology that we have and the instruments of war that we're able to project powerfully around the world are so much more advanced. So I don't care whether you were for the war or against the war, and there was plenty of reason to debate both sides of that issue going in. I don't think many people will argue with the success of the war, or really will argue from a moral standpoint with whether or not we've done the right thing. We have done the right thing. This was a more difficult war to bring the international community together behind, because it was a preemptive or preventive war. More so, for instance, than what we did in the first Gulf War, even more so perhaps than what was done in Kosovo, not more so than what was done in Panama and in some other instances. And I think we have to keep in mind that multilateralism is good in some situations, but unilateralism is also good in some situations where the national interests of the country require it. The surest and best test of a great power is the ability to act unilaterally if indeed the interests of the country require it. Now, we fought the war, we fought it successfully, we've won it, and we have to win the peace. And winning the peace, I think, has always been a tougher job than winning the war. There are a lot of things involved with winning the peace, and the first thing that we have to do is to, in effect, reconstruct Iraq, and that means we've got to put a government in place there that is of Iraqis and by Iraqis and for Iraqis. And it has to be some sort of a representative or consensual government. I think it may be too much to expect that we're going to simply drop a Jeffersonian democracy in place in Baghdad. But it has to have some sort of representational characteristics, and the various ethnic groups and divisions in Iraq, and there are many of them, have to participate in choosing that government. It has to be a government that is at peace with its neighbors, that is generally, I think it would be good if it was generally acceptable, particularly to the Arab neighbors of Iraq, and certainly it has to be a government that doesn't oppress its citizens. That's part of winning the peace. That's a big part of it. There are other elements, and some of those are the following: maintaining the territorial integrity of that country. There are a lot of countries neighboring Iraq who have interests there that they're going to likely want to pursue. Turkey is one, Iran is one, Syria to a lesser degree is one. So we have to maintain the territorial integrity of the country. We have to prevent score settling on the part of these ethnically divided people of Iraq. You probably know that you have a band of Kurds in the north that are in the majority. You have Sunnis in the center, and you have a Shiite majority in the south and elsewhere in Iraq that is really the majority of the population. And we have to prevent score settling on the part of those different ethnic groups. And lastly, of course, we've got to prevent the occurrence of humanitarian disasters. We've got to get a lot of humanitarian relief in there. There are going to be a lot of refugees. And we have to avoid, if at all possible, the institution of a radical theocracy, particularly by the Shiites. I remember back when I was Secretary of State and we had elections in Algeria in 1992, and the hardline radical Islamic fundamentalists co-opted the process. And we were faced with a very serious issue of what to do about that. We need to handle the winning of the peace in Iraq in a way that doesn't face us with a similar situation. There's been a lot of talk about who ought to be in charge of the administration of a reconstructed Iraq. There will be a vital role for the United Nations to play, as President Bush has said, but the United Nations will not be, in my opinion, put in charge of the administrative power of the administrative position of reconstructing Iraq. And that is because the last thing in the world we need right now is to have a bureaucratized and politically divisive fight again in the Security Council about how we go about rebuilding that country. We're going to need the help of a lot of people. We cannot do it alone. There are a lot of countries. There will be other countries there, and there is a big role for the United Nations to play in humanitarian issues, in humanitarian assistance and refugee issues. There are a lot of complex questions. The oil for food program and what happens to that is a very difficult question. The sanctions from 1991 is a difficult question. These are the sanctions we put on there at the end of the last war. Many people have argued for a number of years that these sanctions only hurt the Iraqi people because of the behavior of Saddam Hussein and the leadership. Those sanctions need to be lifted, but we face a situation today in the Security Council where some member countries are trying to leverage their position by wanting to debate whether or not we lift those sanctions. And as I told the folks earlier at breakfast, in my view, what we ought to do is drop a resolution on the table that says sanctions are ended. And I don't think anybody is going to be outrageous enough to try and leverage their position on the backs of the suffering Iraqi people. We have the issue of the debts of Iraq that are owed particularly to countries like Russia and France, and how many of those debts are going to be honored, and whether any of those debts are what we call odious debts, that is, where money was used, spirited out of the country by Saddam and his henchmen, or used to build palaces, whether that debt ought to be rejected, whether we go into the Paris Club and ask for rescheduling, and how much of it we reschedule. We've got the issue now confronting us, of course, and we may talk some about that this morning, of what do we do next, where do we go next. We've talked about some of these rogue nations that are interested in developing weapons of mass destruction and supporting in various ways terrorism, global terrorism. What do we do next with Syria? Secretary Powell was there yesterday. Just left. He had, as best I can tell, a very fine trip there, and from the standpoint of the Syrians taking notice of what happened in Iraq. The North Koreans have already noticed what happened in Iraq. I don't think it's too much to say, particularly with reference to the Middle East, that the strategic sands are shifting, or maybe have shifted. And there's some opportunities that are going to present themselves for us to do some things and accomplish some things in the interest of peace, in the interest of restraining the development and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, in the interest of fighting terrorism that we didn't have before this war was fought. We're going to ask the Syrians to end their support of Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah. These are organizations operating for the most part, some in Damascus, but some operating out in Lebanon, who believe that strapping dynamite to your body and going into Tel Aviv or Jerusalem and blowing up innocent civilians is not terrorism. That's fighting a war of liberation. Well, that's not the way we Americans define terrorism. And Syria and Iran are the two countries that sponsor these groups, and maybe we can make some good progress there. One thing I know Syria will not be doing is harboring any of the top Iraqi leadership. We've got some options in this area, by the way, ladies and gentlemen. I don't mean to suggest they're military options. There is a military option down the line, but we've got some opportunities now that are political and diplomatic in nature where we can make some real progress. We've got to turn our attention here at home to the economy. That's what the President is doing. We need to do whatever we can to fix our economy. After all, the American economy has been the engine of global growth for many years, and when we get sick, the global economy gets sick. So I wouldn't worry too much about military action as an agenda item over the near term. Iraq was a particularly unique case. Iraq was something we'd been trying to deal with for 12 years. Iraq was in violation of many UN Security Council resolutions. We've got the question of post-war diplomacy, and I'm sure Tom will want to talk a little bit about that. We need friends and allies around the world. We have relied upon, and very satisfactorily so, a number of alliances and organizations throughout the last 40 years, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization for one. And it's important that we reconstruct those alliances, that we maintain those alliances, but in doing so, I think it's also important to understand that reconciliation is a two-way street. We had some differences with France and Germany and Russia, and we need to find a way back on track with those countries, but reconciliation is a two-way street, and they need as well to come toward us. And one way to do that would be not to object to the lifting of sanctions on the Iraqi people. There's nothing wrong with our expressing our disappointment about what happened in the divisive debate over that second resolution. We can express that disappointment both in words and in deeds, but we can't let that disappointment cloud our judgment as far as the long term is concerned. It is important that we maintain these alliances and that we reconstruct them. When you consider the community of interests that we have with particularly these three countries, France, Germany, and Russia, trade interests, interest in fighting the war on terrorism globally. So there's nothing wrong with showing our disappointment both by word and by deed, but we need to ultimately get back on track. Let me say a quick word about North Korea. This is perhaps one of the most difficult problems facing policymakers today. North Korea is Exhibit A for the proposition that you shouldn't let these rogue nations develop nuclear weapons, because then they'll use those nuclear weapons to blackmail you, to threaten you, to extort you, and they're much more difficult to deal with once they get the nuclear weapons. We have a very difficult situation now, a very dangerous situation. This is a regime that is, I'm no longer Secretary of State, so I can say this, that is very flaky. They engage frequently in aberrant behavior, and it's good to see that we've just had some dialogue with them, with the Chinese in attendance, because the People's Republic of China is the one country that has some influence on North Korea. But we need to make it clear to the North Korean that the days when crime would pay is over. We're no longer going to pay them for paper promises. And unfortunately, we did that in 1994. We entered into an agreement with them. They promised they wouldn't pursue their nuclear program. And so we sent them 500,000 metric tons of oil a year free, courtesy of you taxpayers. And lo and behold, we find out, well, they never did keep their paper promise to us. So we need to talk to them now. There's nothing wrong with talking. Talking is not appeasement. Talking would only be appeasement if we were going to give them something for yet another paper promise. The solution in North Korea, in my opinion, is for us to engage with them, get a verifiable, on the ground, anywhere, anytime, any place type agreement from them that they would freeze their nuclear program, that we can go in there and inspect and satisfy ourselves that they're not breaking their word to us, and that they would ship those 8,000 plutonium rods out of the country, or let us take them out of the country. And for that, we should give them some security assurances that we're not going to invade them and we're not going to start a war against them. Now, whether we can get there or not, I don't know, but I think it's encouraging to see the administration trying that approach. If that doesn't work, maybe we ought to do some of the kinds of things that we suggested in 93 and 94 when the so-called framework agreement was entered into, and that's taking North Korea to the Security Council and obtaining some economic or political sanctions against their further development of weapons of mass destruction, and perhaps even some sort of a Security Council resolution embargoing their continuing traffic in missiles and in potential weapons of mass destruction. Lastly, let me simply say that we have 37,000 American troops on the Korean Peninsula. It's a relic of the Cold War, but on the Korean Peninsula, the Cold War never ended. We have 37,000 American troops at the 38th parallel facing 1 million North Koreans. And these troops are in, if something should happen, they would be in very great danger. I don't think it's too much for us to at least think about ringing up the North Koreans privately. And again, I can say this because I'm not a policymaker. And saying, you know, fellas, we kept the peace in Europe against an overwhelming Soviet conventional superiority for 40 years through the use of our strategic nuclear deterrent. And we no longer have the need or use for that in the same way that we did before, but we still have the deterrent. And we have a security treaty with South Korea and Japan, and we are going to implement that treaty, and we're going to abide by that treaty. And you can just stop threatening to burn the South and go to war with South Korea unless you are willing to accept the consequences. Now, that's the kind of message that I think the North Korean regime would understand and would respect. This is a regime that was built on force, and it really only understands force and strength and resolve. I'm not sure that it understands conciliation and accommodation. One quick word about the Arab-Israeli dispute. There are two things that we can do to improve the situation in the Middle East and improve the standing of America in the Middle East. And that is to deal with the Arab-Israeli dispute in a hands-on and aggressive way. The administration has said they're going to. A very good sign is the fact that they put the roadmap for peace in the Middle East on the table, and they rebuffed arguments from the parties that first we needed to negotiate some changes in the roadmap. They said, no, this is it. This is a roadmap for peace, by the way, that was agreed to by the United States, the European Union, the United Nations, and Russia. It's called the Quartet. We need to put that on the table, and we need to press forward with its implementation. A couple of things that the roadmap calls for, one of which is to end settlement activity in the occupied territories. Israel should end settlement activity because there is no solution to the Arab-Israeli dispute except to trade those occupied lands for peace, a full, complete, and secure peace from Israel's Arab neighbors. And to the extent that you settle those lands, you foreclose the opportunities and possibilities for negotiation. On the other hand, there ought to also be a 100% verifiable 100% effort on the part of the Palestinian Authority to end terror. The Palestinian Authority cannot control all of the Palestinian terror groups. I mentioned Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah, and that's why it's so important that we lean on Syria to get a handle on those groups. But at the very least, there needs to be a 100% effort. And then we need to move that roadmap. We need to move down the path of that roadmap. The administration says they're going to do it. I'm very hopeful that they will do so. I believe that they will do so. Nothing could be more important, frankly, in dealing with the continuing problems in the Middle East, and particularly in solving the Arab-Israeli dispute, which, of course, is a dispute of such long standing and that has contributed so much pain and suffering to people all around the world. Let me end there, if I might, John, and I'd be delighted to take your questions, ladies and gentlemen, or take Tom's. I don't know which come first, but let me close by simply saying it's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to be with you here in Boston today.
I pitch batting practice. The tough ones come from them, Mr. Secretary.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for doing this again. If I could share with you something we used to say about you in the press rooms of your long and astonishing career, some of us called you the Harry Suitcase Simpson of government, after a professional ball player in the 1950s who was traded from Chicago to St. Louis to Philadelphia to Kansas City, even to the Yankees. And I was wondering, as you went through the period from when you were a lawyer in Texas to now, if in addition to there being a personal journey, there had been an intellectual one as well, and what kind of a journey that was, and is there still something of the Houston Democratic lawyer in you?
In those days, Tom, everybody in Texas was a Democrat, including the conservatives. So I was a conservative Democrat, I have to admit to you. I don't know Suitcase Simpson. I hope he batted more than 101, but Intellectual change, maybe so, but you know, one thing that I found out through that government service is that, at least in my view, leadership is, and to the extent that I saw it, and I'm not talking about on my own part, but leadership is variously defined, but it's not, you know, it's not the private preserve of extremely talented individuals. Leadership seems to me to be nothing more than simply knowing what to do and then doing it. And I saw that quite often with the presidents I served, all three of whom were men of great character and integrity, with varying political accomplishments and dexterity. But when we were talking upstairs, I told you, here I ran a campaign for George Bush in the 1980 primaries against Governor Ronald Reagan, and woke up after the general election in 1980 to the great surprise of President-elect Reagan asked me to be his White House Chief of Staff. I thought, how does this happen? Well, I suppose they wanted somebody who knew Washington and who'd been there before and that sort of thing. But I learned some things. When I ran that Bush campaign, I was part of a campaign that referred to supply-side economics as voodoo economics. I found out that was wrong. I've acknowledged in speeches and comments for many, many years. I became Treasury Secretary for that president. And I saw that economic program generate tremendous economic growth in this country. Beginning in 1982, I think I said upstairs, we've had 20 years of sustained non-inflationary economic growth with only 7 down quarters in 20 years. And I believe it's because we came in 1981 and we cut the top marginal tax rate from 70% down to 50%. And then in 1986, when I was Treasury Secretary, we cut it down to 28%. You give people a little more of the money that they own to spend for themselves and less to go to the government, and I think it generates tremendous economic growth, which in turn increases tax revenues. The way to increase taxes, in my view, is to increase tax revenues. Now, that was a sea change in my thinking from where I was in 1980. And I also learned during those years with Governor Reagan, with President Reagan, that the appetite of Congress to spend, and this is not partisan, it doesn't matter whether they're Republicans or Democrats, but the spending appetite of Congress is voracious. And if you want to do something about the deficit, it doesn't do any good just to raise the tax bar up to what the spending bar is, because the spending bar is going to keep going up. You have to put some sort of restraint on spending. That's the way to get the deficit under control. But that was a philosophical change in my view from that.
What about in terms of your view of the world over this period? Gosh, God knows the world changed so dramatically in this time. What about you?
Well, the world changed fundamentally, as I wrote in that book that was cited in John's generous introduction. It really did change. But you know, when I came in 1981, I didn't have a lot of really well-formulated views of the way I thought the world should be or the way I thought the world was. Now, after serving 4 years in the first Reagan term as Chief of Staff and attending all the National Security Council meetings, I learned a lot. I became a fairly ardent Cold Warrior, but I wasn't as ardent as some of the people in that administration. I do believe that we need friends, as I said here, from the podium. But the most important thing, I think, when you talk about formulating and implementing foreign policy, the most important thing to focus on is what is the national interest of the United States. And of equal importance, perhaps secondary, but close to equal importance, is will a particular policy support the principles and values of the United States, or will it not? So I like to see a foreign policy formulation and implementation process that gives effect to national interest, but that also gives effect to principles and values. So I'm somewhere, I suppose, I don't think you could say I'm totally a realist, realpolitik, or an idealist. I'm somewhere in the middle. I think you win political campaigns from the middle. I don't think you win them from the fringes. I'm not talking about nominating contests. I'm talking about general elections.
You said, and you're right, a little bit ago that I'd be interested in the current diplomacy post Iraq War. But I wanted to begin by asking you about a somewhat rare venture into the public domain by you last summer. I guess it's not correct to say you spoke out. It's more you wrote out at a time when the decision about whether to go to the United Nations had not yet been made. In fact, the decision to go to the Congress had not been made. And rather than attempt the impossible of putting words in your mouth, I was wondering if you could summarize what you were trying to achieve and say when you wrote last summer on these topics.
I'm not sure that the decision to go to Congress, I think maybe that had been made, but I know this was in late August, and the administration was debating whether or not to try and go to the United Nations before initiating conflict in Iraq. And I felt quite strongly that the right thing to do would be to exert every effort. The way I put it, I think, Tom, was to exert every effort not to have to go it alone. Okay? The president decided to go to the UN. It was, in my opinion, absolutely the right thing to do. He got as you know, he got a 15-0 vote of the Security Council, telling Iraq to disclose, to cooperate, and to disarm, 3 things, and saying if you don't do that, there'll be serious consequences. Where things got all wrapped around the axle, of course, was in the negotiations over the second resolution. That is the one that specifically said the serious consequences are the use of force to either change the regime or to discover and destroy the weapons of mass destruction. And there was quite a bit of debate over that. I supported the concept of going for the second resolution, but not particularly the way in which it happened. And by that I mean I think it would have been better not to let that become an issue of big public debate, not to put that resolution in effect on the table until you knew you had the votes to get it. I think if a mistake was made, that was a mistake.
As always, one is interested in your analysis that accompanies a public statement you made, like the article you wrote last summer. And I was wondering, as you thought about a situation where the question of whether to go to the United Nations was in doubt at the moment you wrote, was it your analysis that the non-decision was a matter of ideological struggle or pragmatic differences of opinion?
I don't think that, I don't believe that was a matter of ideological struggle, no. I really don't. I think there were some in the administration who were concerned about what ultimately happened on the second resolution. That if you go for one and don't get it, you may be worse off than if you haven't gone before. I was operating, of course, from the perspective of what we did in the 1990-1991 context, where we had, in effect, the rest of the world with us in ejecting Iraq from Kuwait. That, of course, if you can get it, is a much better position from which to wage war.
Another phrase I heard from the podium today that we've all heard so many times in the months that Iraq has been with us and will continue to be with us. You referred to the territorial integrity of Iraq.
Yeah.
And a phrase that obviously is a lot more complicated than it sounds. And it reminds me of 2 of my favorite images of you as Secretary of State, to illustrate the conflicting pressures that especially an American official must deal with. One of them is just before the breakup of Yugoslavia, In Europe you were, and I can see you almost plaintively warning that while self-determination was unfolding, that perhaps something terrible was about to happen. And the second picture I can think of was as a crowd that greeted you after the Cold War had ended in Albania, in Tirana.
Yeah.
I think there must have been 1 million people there, and you must have seen for yourself what self-determination looks like. And I was wondering how, with the territorial integrity of Iraq in the background, how one balances the urges of people to resolve their own destiny among themselves, on the one hand, self-determination, and these concepts of sovereignty and territorial integrity on the other.
Well, it's a very, very difficult issue and an extraordinarily good question because I think when we talk about self-determination, and what I was saying when I was in Yugoslavia is self-determine, yes, but self-determine peacefully. That's what the Helsinki Accords required, and we were parties. The United States were party to those accords, and so was the state of Yugoslavia. And so, by the way, were all of the European countries whose views I was representing. I was representing the views of 32 countries around the world when I said our policy is to respect the territorial integrity of Yugoslavia. And if you're going to break up, you must break up peacefully through dialogue and negotiation. If you go to war to break up, if you shut down border posts and that sort of thing, you're going to trigger one heck of a civil war. That's exactly what I said to them, and of course that is what happened. With Albania, it was a little bit different. I mean, there you really you had sort of a peaceful revolution because the old hardline communists were kicked out, and the reason there were so many people, it turned out, from an American Secretary of State in Tirana, Albania, a city with, I think, a population of 150,000, we must have had 600,000 people there, is because these people had been denied freedom for 50 years. It was a very closed country, as you know. And when they were given freedom, it just burst through like that. But self-determination is a wonderful principle. It's something we should support, but we ought to always make it clear when we talk about it, we're talking about self-determination through peaceful means.
To put this in a current context, like Iraq, one of the additional complicating factors, it seems to me, that you can have a peaceful decision by peoples to determine their destiny, perhaps to separate from a larger entity, but some outside entity objects, intervenes militarily, and suppresses. It's something that could certainly happen in terms of the Kurds in Turkey.
Yeah.
It's something in the south of Iraq where there are other considerations. How does America remain true to our values in managing so many conflicting democratic urges?
Well, by doing it, I think, in the way that I suggested, and that is saying, look, the principle of self-determination is a wonderful principle, but it implies peaceful self-determination, not forceful. So we have to, when we go in like we've done in Iraq, it is important, I think, that we see to it that some sort of a consensual or representative government of, by, and for Iraqis is put in place. Then if they want to self-determine down to the city level, that's their business. Self-determination is not good if you take it all the way down to the county level, unless it's done peacefully. And if it's done peacefully, then it's fine. So whenever you talk about self-determination, I think you ought to remember to put the preface peaceful self-determination in front of it. It's like when we talk about Muslim fundamentalism. We have a lot of really good friends who are Muslim fundamentalists, and a lot of countries that are very close allies of the United States that are fundamentalist Muslim countries. And the problem we have is when that fundamentalism turns radical. So remember, in that case, to always put, in what I try and remember, always put radical Islamic fundamentalism.
Of course, in trying to follow all of this, one of the things that helps dummies like people in my racket is when the government speaks clearly. And it becomes a somewhat harder story to cover when the government, sometimes our own, speaks with more than one, more than two, more than three voices. And I've learned from experience that it's pointless to ask you a trick question. So I thought maybe using the technique the Chinese did with wall posters in the 19th to talk about some obscure 13th century situation, and the analogy would hopefully be obvious. In your book, you praise President George Herbert Walker Bush for his management of foreign policy, one of the features of which was clarity and unity. How does a president successfully manage his government so that it speaks clearly?
Well, I think it's to make sure that there are specific and well understood lines of authority and responsibility. This is a problem that all presidents have, and you see it. It doesn't matter what the political party of the administration is. But the president himself sets the example and lays out the line and enforces discipline upon his cabinet.
Which makes the conduct of an administration legitimately revealing of a president's firm, light touch.
Sometimes. You know, ladies and gentlemen, I have to tell you that we had breakfast upstairs for about 45 minutes. And everybody at the table tried to get this question answered, and nobody got it answered, and Tom's not going to get it answered every day. So.
The trick is to fail elegantly as well as peacefully.
Nice try, Tom. Nice try.
Before I ask this last softball, if I could encourage you all to go to the microphone to ask questions of the Secretary, whatever's on your mind. Let me ask just one Middle East, Arab, Israeli question, if I might. You mentioned, with the roadmap's publication now, the likely onset of a period of much more intense American engagement. Lord knows you were engaged up to your eyeballs. There's a famous videotape of you on Capitol Hill reminding Yitzhak Shamir what the White House's telephone number was, if I'm not mistaken. How do we measure successful presidential engagement in a long-running dilemma like this one?
Well, you measure it by making sure that you understand and appreciate A, the constraints under which the president is operating, and B, what the potential window of opportunity is for him to move. I've said that there is a window of opportunity now, and I believe there is, given what we've done in Iraq, to move the Middle East peace process. We have today something we didn't have back in my day. We have a roadmap that's been basically signed onto by most of the rest of the world, the United Nations, the European Union, Russia, and the United States. The United States is the only player really in this game that can bring the parties together, given our very close association with our ally Israel, given the fact that we are firmly and irrevocably committed to Israel's security. We have influence with Israel. And what we have to do is to find a way to get over the opposition of hardliners, Tom, on both sides of the equation. Those Arabs who are not willing to accept Israel's right to exist, still want to fight, still want to push Israel, if possible, into the sea, still want to return to the 67 border. And the hardline Israelis, on the other hand, who don't want to trade the occupied lands for peace. There's no formula that will get us to peace except a land for peace under 242 and 338. So the hardliners are on both sides are the problems. And there are ways in which an administration can use its influence on both sides to jump across some of those
How much of a
problems.
window?
Well, the window should be open for quite a bit of time, actually. You know, generally speaking, labor governments in Israel are more inclined to lean toward peace. The peace process took a terrible step backward, of course, when my friend and our friend and America's friend and Israel's friend Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated. Here's a Israeli prime minister who really wanted to make peace, and there's some indications that the current prime minister would like to make peace, notwithstanding the fact that his government is seen to be a hardline government. So there's some time. The window is not that narrow. The strategic sands, as I said to you earlier, have shifted in the Middle East. People will remember for some time what we've just accomplished in Iraq. That was good for moderate Arab states in the region, and it was particularly good for Israel as well.
Thank you so very much for your patience. Go right ahead, please. Just please be brief as you can. There isn't a great deal of time.
France, Germany, and Russia, all of their opposition and the difficult relationship we had with them over the last 6 months. Could you go into some detail of what you think are some of the background reasons why those three states, they're all individual states, I recognize, but why they were so intractable in their positions against us?
Well, the reasons were a bit different in the case of each country, in my view. First of all, Germany was extraordinarily disappointing to someone who worked as hard as our administration did to to unify Germany in peace and freedom as a member of North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to see a German leadership campaign on a platform of anti-Americanism, run a political campaign, in effect, on anti-Americanism. That's what happened there. And that's very, very disappointing, because Germany would never have been unified but for America. We had to roll the British, we had to roll the French, we had to convince the Soviet Union to permit Germany to unify, and we did it. And 10 years later, a German leader is running on a platform of anti-Americanism. That's very, very disappointing. The French and Russian issues are a bit different. These countries were Iraq used to be a client state of the Soviet Union, to which Russia is the most prominent successor. Iraq owes Russia a lot of money, in excess, I think, of $8 or $9 billion. They also owe a debt, I think, to France, and France was a big trading partner for a while of Iraq. But more than that, in the case of France and Russia, I think it was a desire to be seen to be a counterweight to American power. This country of ours, ladies and gentlemen, occupies a uniquely preeminent place in world affairs today. You have to go back a long time to find a situation where any other country had the economic and political stability and military capabilities that we have globally. And there's a lot of, therefore, resentment and jealousy and envy of that. And so I think all of those things played into this situation. I think it was counterproductive on the part of some countries, particularly permanent members of Security Council, to go about it the way they did, to announce preemptively that they were going to veto anything that was put on the table in connection with that second resolution. That tends to weaken the UN, in my opinion, in a situation where we are trying our best to utilize the Security Council and to go through that mechanism. To make that statement in advance really meant that it really prevented us from pulling together the 9 votes that we needed for an affirmative resolution. And it thereby weakens the very institution which gives some of these countries greater stature and power than perhaps they enjoy standing alone.
Over here, and I apologize that the shortness of time probably makes it best that we keep it to the people who are now at the microphones. Over there, please.
Regarding Afghanistan, how do we advance the frontiers of freedom in Afghanistan and remove the tribal warlords that are more fascist and support the central government? Do we use Mr. Rumsfeld's capable defense force?
Well, you're going to have to use military means to promote stability and peace to the extent that there are military engagements taking place, to the extent that our people are still being shot at, to the extent that the central government is being resisted by warlords. I don't know any other way to put it down than through military means, and I think it is perfectly appropriate to do that. I sat upstairs, and I want to say here, one of the unwritten stories, I think, today, and Tom's going to write this in the Globe the next week or so, is the progress we're making in the war on terrorism. There are 3,000 plus Al-Qaeda people today in jail. There are if you measure the number of terrorist incidents on a pro forma basis for this year versus last year, you'll see that there are far fewer. I don't know, by a large percentage. I don't have it in my head. We're making good progress in the war on terrorism. And we're making it through the cooperation of other countries, including these countries that were the subject of this question here, Russia and France and Germany. These countries are all cooperating with us in the war on terrorism. And of course, we are the biggest exporting country in the world, so we have trade interests with them. So we got a lot of reasons to get back on the right track with these countries, but they need to remember that reconciliation is a two-way street. But that's the way it seems to me we've got to continue operating in Afghanistan. There is no Taliban with any serious presence in Afghanistan as far as I know today, and that is a plus.
The reason he's so popular is that he functions both as editor and source. Thank you very much.
My name is Michael Jovanovic, and I'm Serbian. I have lived in this country as long as President Bush. He was 1 year old when I came to America. John F. Kennedy Library is a unique place in America, probably in the world. Harvard University cannot match with their faculty, all their faculties, the kind of people that come here to talk, and you, sir, belong to the top few. You mentioned that you switch parties. Well, that is okay. That shows that gentlemen also can change their views, not only the ladies. You are in a good company when you change parties. Mussolini changed, and so did Churchill.
Mussolini
changed the parties. And so
look, I'm in good company anyway. I share the same birthday with Saddam Hussein.
Now, Shakespeare said that I may ask a stupid question in order to get wiser by your answer. America fights for freedom and democracy in the world. You participated in reunification of Germany, and you participated in disintegration of Yugoslavia. In Bosnia, 1.5 million Muslims used force and violence against the majority of Serbs, who are 10 million. And President Bush, with whom you served, and you used force and violence on the side of the minority instead to use democratic process. In Kosovo, 2 million of Albanians used force and violence against 10 million of the Serbs. And then Clinton, who inherited your administration, used force and violence. You rightly so want peaceful solution, but you did not use democratic process in Yugoslavia.
Could I stop you there? There are 3 people behind you, and we have almost no time.
Yeah, I know, but you see...
Question.
Just a minute. The question is this. Do you approve what you did and President Clinton did in disintegration Yugoslavia and integration of Germany?
Well, I certainly approve of what we did, and don't forget that we were there in 91, and Tom mentioned the fact that I came and met with every president of the republics of the former Yugoslavia, and I said, do not declare independence, do not self-determine unless you do it peacefully. And I think that was the right message, and it seems to me that that accords with your position if you're Serbian. Our message at the time was do it peacefully. And we never entered into military action as best I'm aware. It happened after we left for by the way, I think some very good reasons. But I used to say when people talk to me about this, and I hope this is not taken the wrong way by you, but I used to, when people would try to draw me out into a discussion of the relative merits or demerits of the positions of people in the former Yugoslavia, that there were no Boy Scouts in Yugoslavia. I don't care what side you were on. There were atrocities committed by everybody. Bosnians, Croatians, and Serbs.
You're 100% right, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Next, please. Thank you very much for your patience.
Hi, my name is Dave Buck, and my question is, yes, I would say to some extent we got off easy in Iraq. Maybe if we had similar ventures in the future, we might continue to get off relatively easy, i.e., for example, we didn't have to fight a major guerrilla war there in Iraq. But wouldn't we still be better off if we would use more limited forms of force rather than all-out war? For example, there was a proposal by some American and British church leaders that was presented to Tony Blair, which would have involved international tribunal, criminal tribunal, to put a lot of pressure on Hussein to start delegitimizing him more. B, there would have been much more aggressive and comprehensive inspections. There would have also been humanitarian aid now as opposed to later for the Iraqi people. Couldn't we be using more limited forms of force to resolve these differences instead of spending $90 billion on an all-out war?
You know, we tried for 12 years through the United Nations Security Council in resolution after resolution after resolution to bring pressure to bear upon him, and it didn't work. And if you're going to go into war, if you're going to use force, military force, you sure don't want to use less than an amount sufficient to get the job done. You remember all the comments during the course of this war, particularly after it had been going on about 10 days or 2 weeks, when a lot of these retired generals were on all over the cable channel saying, well, we've really screwed up here. There's not enough force in the country to do the job. Well, they were wrong. So there was enough force. If you're going to use force, you got to use enough to make sure you get the job done and accomplish the mission. But we tried for 12 years to bring pressure to bear on Saddam to get him to comply with UN Security Council resolutions.
For the
let me just finish real quickly.
No, one to a question. You're going to deprive two nice young guys who have been very patient, and we need you to be very brief because the Secretary, bless his heart, is staying, but there's a plane waiting, and so...
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. I've really enjoyed your comments. Just very quickly, I was curious if we could get a little bit beyond the Middle East and beyond Europe and look to Latin America quickly. Mm-hmm. One of the problems with the administration's, I guess, foreign policy platform during the election was lack of experience, and it seemed like there was going to be a historic opportunity to work with President Fox, and as a Texan, we expected more. So I was wondering if you could speak to what you think of potential for future U.S.-Latin American relations and Mexico specifically.
Yeah, well, that's a really good question because, you know, for many years, Latin America has been moving toward democracy and free markets. And countries down there that had adopted the central statist model and that were not particularly democratic but rather authoritarian. Now you're seeing some of that movement going in the other direction. And I'm quite confident that you're going to see the administration react to that and try and deal with that. I mean, I think they have already. There's a lot that you don't read about, given a war in Iraq and threat from North Korea and all the other things that are at the top of the fold in the newspapers. With respect to Vicente Fox, the president and Vicente Fox are actually good friends. And, you know, Vicente Fox is the first leader of Mexico not to come from the PRI, the party that's ruled Mexico for 70 years. And so everybody had great hopes at the very beginning. One of those hopes was for some sort of an immigration accord that would deal with the problems of undocumented workers and illegal aliens and whatever you want to call them coming across the border. It was a little bit too ambitious for the political system to bear, particularly in this country. Fox had staked a lot of his reputation, not reputation, but a lot of his power internally in Mexico on getting that. He was unable to get it. It's one reason Jorge Castaneda resigned as foreign minister. Fox is in a very difficult position because he doesn't control his legislature. He's a president with a legislature of the opposite party. It reminds me of the 8 years I spent with Ronald Reagan and the 4 years I spent with the first George Bush. We never had a Republican Congress. But Mexico is an extraordinarily important relationship for the United States, and President Bush really knows it very well. He was governor of Texas for 2 terms, and he's on good terms with those people down there. And I bet you're going to see some movement. You'll see us definitely trying to address the Latin American issues.
Thank you.
And thank you. And if you can be as brief as possible, you have the last question.
My name's Tom. I'm from BC High. I was wondering, how did Tariq Aziz, as a Christian, rise so high into power in Iraq?
How did Tariq Aziz get to be so powerful in Iraq? Because he's a Christian?
Yeah, in like a Muslim dog.
Well, it reminds me of what we used to say about President Reagan. We used to say President Reagan doesn't like yes men. When he says no, we all say no. And that's what Tariq Aziz is like with Saddam Hussein. And if he hadn't been that way...
Okay, thank you.
John, I'd forgotten how much fun it is to fail at getting Secretary Baker to say more than you want him to.
Mr. Secretary, we are very honored that you have been here with us today. I will, as a concluding statement, it won't be conclusive, try to do what Tom Oliphant has been trying so hard all morning to do, and I will simply thank you for emphasizing that our country's security depends above all on diplomacy and on having allies and friends around the world. It depends on a lot else, but it certainly depends on those, and your career and your leadership has exemplified, I think, that point, and thank you for your presence here, and thank you for your remarks.
Thank you, John. Thank you.